Okay.
And then it'll start the file transfer as soon as it ends.
Okay.
So it'll take another couple minutes, and then there should be a folder set up. And so it's
That'll pop open, or
it's the adjacent folder will pop open, so it's like with updates.
okay.
Yeah. The MP3, the MP4, and another file that is full of me.
Okay. Do you have
Bobby usually does that because I don't have access to the lab channel.
Okay, I'll have her do it.
She's normally very. You have to give her the title. Usually within 20.
Thanks. Anybody else? I don't know. I'll admit it.
Frank, can we move the mic towards your end of the table?
Yeah. Can somebody pull that? There should be extra cable on that microphone.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, maybe it's.
Oh, it's right down.
And maybe just put it around over to this. Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Thanks.
Great. And put this down. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. So this week we're going to finish chapter 2, which is on the neural structures involved in speech. We will be focusing on the cerebral cortex this week. We covered the main subcortical areas last week, most notably basal ganglia, thalamus, cerebellum. Now we're going to talk about the cortical areas, many of which are connected up through the loops I talked about last week with the substructures. Anyway. Okay, so just first to orient ourselves, this is a regular view of the cerebral cortex from the lateral side, meaning the brain is not deformed in any way in this image. And so to orient us, I'm going to point out a few key landmarks here. So there's the central sulcus, which splits up the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex. And immediately in front of the central sulcus are motor areas, primary motor cortex. Immediately behind are subcortical areas, somatosensory cortical areas, and those are aligned, as we saw before, with the body representation. Body parts align with each other. Left inferior frontal cortex is where a lot of language things are happening, so we're going to look in great detail in there. Temporal cortex has the auditory cortical areas. We'll focus a lot on that as well. In addition to the somatosensory cortex, the parietal cortex has a lot of association areas that combine visual information with other modalities like body parts for planning and spatial representation of movements. So parietal cortex is a higher order part of cortex, much like prefrontal cortex. So these are areas that aren't tied to a single sensory modality or motor modality. They're more kind of cognitive in function. The occipital cortex is where the visual cortex is. We will very rarely talk about it. You'll sometimes see activation in here in speech studies. That is almost always because they're reading the stimuli or looking at a picture. And so, in an fMRI study of speech, you would try to, in the resting condition, they would be looking at something, but oftentimes that's still not quite enough to cancel out the visual activity due to reading the stimuli. So those are the main lobes of the cortex, they're called. There's one other lobe that shows up when we open up the sulci. So the other major sulcus here is the sylvian fissure. And the sylvian fissure is between the temporal lobe, frontal, and parietal lobes. And deep inside the sylvian fissure, there's all kinds of stuff, cortical stuff. And that stuff only shows up if we use what's called a inflated brain. So what this image is, it's the same brain as above, but now what we've done is, through the magic of computers, basically warp the brain so that you can see the sulci and the gyri. And this is important that you understand this view of the brain, because I'm going to use that pretty much throughout the course. So the gray, dark gray here, those are sulci. So, and they're dark gray because they're, it's indicating that they're below the surface and they're dark in the light. These colors are chosen by the person who makes the image, but that's a good way to remember is the dark sulcus, dark in the sulcus, and these are the dark parts. The light parts are the gyri, the crowns of the gyri. And when we do that, when we open up the sylvian fissure, what you see is there's another lobe in there that's called the insula, or the insular cortex. And sometimes that's considered part of the parietal lobe. Other times it's considered part of the temporal, or sorry, sometimes it's considered its own lobe, sometimes it's part of the temporal lobe. And this is all on the lateral surface. If we look in the medial surface, so at the middle part of the cortex kind of curls over the top here, and there are gyri on the other side. We'll look at them in later images, but they're considered part of the frontal, parietal, and occipital cortex, those medial parts, so there's not an additional lobe on the medial side. Some anatomical terms that will become important are shown here. I think you probably all know that the bumps are called gyri and the grooves are called sulci. Things get a little more complicated though, because different people use different descriptions of things. So the fundus is specifically the very bottommost part of the sulcus, so the deepest part of the sulcus. And if you imagine a line cutting the cortex, so this is the cortical sheet going around, and the cortex in general is like a two-dimensional sheet that's all folded up into a three-dimensional shape. And the gyri here, if you cut these, then this is typically called a gyrus by most people. And according to that definition, there is no sulcal cortex because it's just one gyrus to the next. Other people, including me, use the term sulcus to refer to anything that's below this point. So the point where the the gyri touch each other effectively, neighboring gyri, and the point where they touch is often used as a landmark to cut off what's called the sulcal bank. And the sulcal bank would be the part from this down to here. And so there'd be a sulcal bank similarly on this side as for the other side. And in our parcellation system of the brain that we use for our studies, we would call this sulcus cortex. So our definition of gyrus isn't the same as everyone else's. Some people use gyrus to mean this whole thing. We distinguish the top part of that gyrus from the sulcus. And so the sulcal banks are the cortex within the sulcus. This is very important for speech because most of the cortical activity is actually inside the sulci. And this is why we're using inflated cortical surfaces in this class, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to see. So for example, you cannot see insular cortex at all from this viewpoint, and you miss a lot of cortex. All of this that I'm showing you now is neocortex, and that's what we're going to focus on. A slide or two, I'll go into a little more detail about other kinds of cortex, but we're focusing on neocortex. everybody's clear on those details, then I'll go into one more complicating thing, which is in this insular region, this is like a slice through the insular cortex. So imagine taking a knife and cutting down here, and then looking at it in cross section. What you see are, first of all, the frontal lobe is up here. The temporal lobe is down here. At the point where they contact, the terminology changes to call this the operculum. So in this case, this is the frontal operculum. And the bottom part of this, inside that sulcus, is called the supratemporal plane. And there are subregions that we'll talk about within that, most notably plane temporal, which is very important for speech representation in the auditory system. Then further inside of that, there's the insular cortex. So this cortex is continuous with frontal and parietal and temporal lobes. Here I've shown the frontal part of it. If you go further back, then this is the parietal lobe, and this would be the parietal operculum. That's this part back here. And so all of that stuff's inside of this fissure. So we'll often talk about frontal operculum, for example, which is the very bottommost part of the inferior frontal gyrus up here. And the supratemporal plane is the very innermost part of the superior temporal gyrus in here inside the sylvian fissure. Okay. All right, well, so cerebral cortex, as I mentioned, can be thought of as a layered sheet that has been folded up. And the layers are numbered. And in neocortex, there are 6 layers. The top one, the outermost layer, is layer 1, and the deepest is layer 6. And in these layers, there are different makeups of cell types. So some layers have mostly axons and dendrites. Other layers have pyramidal cells, and so forth. And I'm not going to talk much about that, but it's good to know that, for example, the output neurons from the cortex to subcortical structures come from layer 5 primarily. And inputs to cortical layers go to layer 4 and so forth. So there are all these different within each layer, there's a different makeup of cells, and presumably they're playing somewhat different roles in the overall cortical column. And so people think of the processing unit of cerebral cortex as a column that spans the width of the cortex. So I'm showing with my hands here, if this is the cortical sheet, a column is like a set of 6 layers in a small patch of cortex. And what's been shown in some of the early neurophysiology studies in the visual system, and it's held true in other systems, is cells within a cortical column tend to have the same firing preferences. Like they're affected by the same stimulus. So they're kind of like a single processing unit. They do different things within there. They fire differently when the stimulus comes on, but they tend to be representing a single thing. And that's why they think of cortical columns as representing a processing unit within the cerebral cortex. In the motor cortex, a column might represent a particular muscle or a particular combination of joint angles, something like that. But all the cells in the different layers of the column are sensitive to that same thing. And then as you spread across the sheet, so from the neighboring columns tend to represent similar things to you if you're a column and you've got neighbors. The neighboring ones represent similar things. So if I'm a visual cortex cell and I love lines that are vertically oriented, my neighbors are going to probably like lines that are slightly further away. In the motor cortex, if I like one hand muscle, my neighboring cells are probably going to like either different actions of that muscle or nearby muscles or similar muscles in a similar synergy. That's called a topography or a topographic representation, where neighboring things on the cortex represent neighboring things in some other space. That space could be your body surface and the sensory cortex. It could be the retina and visual cortex. It could be some more abstract space. Now, that topography tends to be true in the primary cortical area, so primary visual cortex, primary motor cortex, primary sensory cortex. But as you go higher up in the neocortex, you get to the association cortical areas, and those represent much more complex things, and topography it's there is usually not, it's not clear exactly what there is, what's that neighboring thing in those association voices. Okay, so all of that's neocortex. However, there are other types of cortex, and cerebral cortex is phylogenetically new, meaning that if you go back in the animal kingdom to when cortex first started occurring, the initial cortex was allocortex. And the difference is that allocortex had fewer layers. The main allocortical things are the hippocampus, which is very involved in memory formation and also in spatial navigation, and the olfactory cortex, which of course is involved in smelling. And those types of cortex are in many, many animals way down the phylogenetic stream. Allocortex has 3 layers instead of 6, and it's more rudimentary in its function, presumably, for that reason. And unfortunately, as with many of these terms, people use different things to refer to allocortex. So, for example, paleocortex means more or less the same thing. Archic cortex and periallocortex. Well, periallocortex means something slightly different, but sometimes it's considered part of allocortex and sometimes it's considered a separate thing. So, but in general, all of those terms refer to the oldest parts of cortex, and we won't be addressing them pretty much at all in this class. Next up in the evolutionary time scale is mesocortex or paralimbic cortex. This has 4 to 5 layers, depending on what animal or part of the brain you're looking at. And as the term meso indicates, it's intermediate to the neocortex and allocortex. And so mesocortex, we'll talk a bit about, because 2 structures in that, I'm going to call it paralimbic cortex in this class. 2 key structures are involved in speech. One of them is the cingulate gyrus, or sometimes called the cingulate cortex, and also the insula. A lot of the insula is paralimbic cortex as well, especially posterior parts, whereas the anterior insula is actually the part that's used in speech. Okay, finally we have neocortex. That's humans have a dramatically increased percentage of neocortex compared to other primates and other animals for that matter. And it has 6 layers, as I described, and another term for neocortex is isocortex. Usually you only hear that, I think, in the detailed neuroanatomy literature, so neocortex is what we'll call it if we use that to distinguish it from paralimbic. Okay, and as you might imagine, since speech and language are human-specific, and the neocortex is much, much more evolved in humans compared to our closest relatives, it's necessary, basically, for language, and most of the language and speech function takes place in the neocortex, especially the fine-grained control. Okay, well, this slide shows a parcellation scheme with a bunch of sulci and gyri on it, and it shows the parcellation scheme we're going to use in this class, and it breaks the brain up into regions of interest. So in this diagram, the white text and arrows indicate sulci. The black text indicates regions of interest. I'm assuming everyone's familiar with these, so I'm not going to go in detail, but of course you'll be responsible for it. We won't normally talk about them in anywhere near the depth that they are created here, but the ones I do want you to know about are the central sulcus. That one's crucial. The precentral sulcus, which is the one in front of the precentral gyrus. So together, the central sulcus and precentral sulcus delineate the precentral gyrus, where motor and premotor things happen. The postcentral sulcus, it runs parallel to the central sulcus, just posterior to it. That delineates the postcentral gyrus, which is the somatosensory cortex. And just in orienting yourself to cortical anatomy if you're not used to it. Those two gyri with those three sulci that are long and cover the whole brain are a great way to orient yourself. So look at this brain again. Like imagine you didn't have any of the lines on there. You could still very easily see the pre and post central gyri on that brain and the sulci in front, in the middle, and in front, in the middle, and behind them. And that is the best way to kind of orient yourself. You know where the central sulcus is now, and that breaks the frontal lobe into the temporal lobe. And knowing where the central sulcus is helps you break up stuff down here as well, because posterior stuff is behind the central sulcus usually, and anterior is the sulcus.
Does every single brain have clearly visible?
Pretty much every human brain that's normally developed, yeah. The precentral sulcus is often broken up here a little bit, so it's not as clear. The postcentral is usually pretty clear, and the central sulcus is very clear. So the central sulcus so the deepest sulci in the brain are the sylvian fissure, the inner hemispheric fissure, which I haven't shown on any of these diagrams, but it's the one that separates the two hemispheres. That's a giant fissure. And fissure and sulcus mean the same thing. That's where fissure is usually used for big sulci, but they mean the same. And the central sulcus then is the third deepest of or the third most prominent sulcus in the brain. Not only is it in almost all the brains, but it's also one of the most functionally specific regions, where the very bottom of that sulcus is where the most primary motor cells are and most primary somatosensory cells are. That's a good kind of functional border as well. Sulci, generally speaking, however, do not line up that great with function. And so that is a constant issue. And I mentioned earlier in class about there's different ways of breaking the brain up into regions of interest. So one of them is based on anatomical landmarks. That's what we're going to use in the class. That's the easiest to follow and most straightforward. But the regions that you pick that way only, some of them are on the boundaries, because many times the bottom of the sulcus is not a distinct boundary between regions. Sometimes it's on the gyre, the crown of the gyrus, for example. So those are always an approximation. The other problem is that different people have different functional areas represented in different gyri sometimes, or in different parts of the gyrus. So that complicates things as well. And that's why we usually stick with these anatomical terms, even though we know that the boundaries are only rough approximations to where the actual functional boundary would be between different clinical regions doing different functions. Let's see. A couple of other important sulci. So here I show the medial surface for the first time, and this sulcus is the cingulate sulcus, and that's the key sulcus within the medial surface, and above it are cortical extensions of the lateral cortical areas. So I'll talk about what these areas are in a bit. And below it is the cingulate cortex that I mentioned earlier, is the paralimbic cortex. Paralimbic cortex in general, so this is also paralimbic cortex around here. It's located at the very margins of the neocortex, where it ends, more or less. And so you can kind of imagine how, as evolution increased the size of the cortex, basically the first cortex was the allocortex. Then from the allocortex, the paralimbic cortex occurred, and then from that, the neocortex occurred. And so the most, the outermost part of the cortex, the part that's most tucked into the by the subcortical structures, that's where you'll find the allocortex. This is the paralimbic cortex here, as well as the insula. This stuff is paralimbic cortex here. And this stuff is involved in motivation and things like that, that I'll talk about in detail. Other terms to pay attention to here. So now I'm going to go on and just kind of describe these, and I don't expect you to remember them all right now, but these are the key anatomical areas. So the precentral gyrus, I'll use PRCG, postcentral gyrus, POCG. Now, within each of these, you can call it many different things. So for example, a lot of times people refer to the precentral gyrus as motor cortex. That's not quite right because part of it's premotor cortex, for example. But generally speaking, the primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus. And so a lot of times people just call that motor cortex. We'll try to be a bit more specific. When we say motor cortex, we're going to mean the parts of the posterior most part of the precentral gyrus, which is where the primary motor cortex is, where the neurons that project down to the periphery are. Postcentral gyrus is POCG. And again, a lot of people call this the somatosensory cortex, although there are complications. Some of somatosensory cortex isn't in there, for example. And together, these two, precentral and postcentral, are called Rolandic cortex. And a little history on that. First of all, the central sulcus is also called the Rolandic sulcus, named after Roland. And Rolandic cortex is the cortex on either side of it. And the reason that these are often referred to as a single thing is it's kind of hard to differentiate the function between the two of them. One of them is certainly more motoric and the other is more somatosensory. But for example, if you damage the somatosensory part but not the motor part, you still have somatic sensation and vice versa. So there's overlap in what they do. And when we look at them in speech, they're always active together. And when we do an analysis that looks at are there speech conditions that separate them, they do not. They're always doing the same thing pretty much. And so often the Rolandic cortex collectively is called sensory motor cortex. Do you want me to repeat all those options one more time? Okay, so the anatomical ones are precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. Functional descriptions of those are often motor cortex, although premotor cortex is in there as well, and somatosensory cortex for the postcentral. Together, they are called Rolandic cortex or sensory motor cortex. And I can't protect you from that. It's going to be in a bunch of papers and stuff, so we're gonna have to use all those, even though it would be nice if we could just stick with them. Okay. All right. So, and then I mentioned cingulate gyrus, and then one other thing to note is that I'll also differentiate lateral premotor areas from medial premotor areas. Lateral premotor areas are on the precentral gyrus and inferior frontal gyrus for speech, so right around here. And the medial premotor areas are the supplementary motor area, which is called SMA, and the pre-supplementary motor area, which is called pre-SMA. These do different things in speech. The medial ones, I believe, many people believe, are involved primarily in initiating and terminating movements and adjusting their kind of timing, whereas the lateral ones seem more involved in representing phonological units and translating them into muscles activation. So this much more of the lateral surface is involved in speech motor programs, but the medial areas are also involved, particularly as I'm going to go through all these areas in more detail as we go. But that's kind of a rough overview of parts of cortex. So you'll see a lot of diagrams that have these lines on them. In one of the appendices of the book, this whole, I think it's Appendix B, this whole system is laid out, and the lines are always going to be in the same place, and I'll almost always use the same anatomical names for the regions within the lines throughout the course. So if you see a diagram and there's not a label on there, you can go look at the appendix to figure out what that ROI is. And from here on, I'm just going to call these ROIs and assume that you know what that is. Okay. All right. Well, so parcellation of the cortex, we've talked about a bit before. And there are a number of parcellation schemes. I just talked about one based on gross anatomical landmarks. That scheme is actually meant to approximate this scheme, which is cytoarchitectonic parcellation. Cytoarchitecture refers to the details of the cells within a layer of cortex, or any part of the brain for that matter. And in particular, what percentage of the cells are stellate cells, say, or pyramidal cells, and what percentage of the area is axons in that layer. so forth. And all of neocortex has 6 layers pretty much, but the thickness of those layers varies a lot from region to region, depending on what the region does. So primary visual cortex gets most of its work is input. It gets a ton of input from the periphery. And so layer 4, or whatever the subcortical layer, off the top of my head, 2 or 4, is enlarged in that cortex. And that's true of sensory cortex in general. They have larger input layers. Motor cortex, on the other hand, has a tiny input layer. In fact, sometimes it's called agranular because it doesn't have the input granule cell layer, or barely has one. But technically it has to be neocortex. So that's a mystery that anatomists live with, a paradox. Anyway, those differences in regions, everyone presumes, have to do with differences in functions. But there's actually not a ton of evidence for that, other than, for the most part, so the original parcellation, cytoarchitectonic one that became very widely used is Brodmann's areas. BA is the term we'll use in this class too, as a abbreviation for them. And so Brodmann's areas, oftentimes the paper will only state what Brodmann area it was and won't say anything else about it. So Brodmann's area is 6. And everybody equates Brodmann's area 6 with premotor cortex. But actually, if you think of premotor cortex as a functional thing, it is not limited to Brodmann's area 6. So it's another one of those where, yeah, it aligns pretty well with area 6. So people call Brodmann's area 6 premotor cortex. But technically speaking, area 6 is based on cytoarchitecture, whereas premotor is based on function. And cytoarchitecture and function don't line up perfectly all the time. So the key Brodmann's areas for speech are area 6, which is premotor cortex, area 4, which is primary motor cortex, area 44, which is part of the inferior frontal gyrus, and Brokaw's area, areas 1, 2, and 3, which collectively are the somatosensory cortex, primary somatosensory cortex. The primary auditory cortex is 41, 42 is sometimes considered also primary, and 22 is a higher order auditory cortex. And then parietal cortex areas, 40 in particular, supramarginal gyrus. And I'll go back over all those areas when we go into the function of those regions. So it would be great if we always had access to this, but cytoarchitecture varies from individual to individual, especially in the region we're most interested in here, which is this left inferior frontal planning, speech planning area. There's wild variability in individuals between what the sulci look like around here. And also a lot of variability where cytoarchitectonic areas fall within those gyri across individuals. So people have, and the other problem is, if you do an MRI study, you cannot see cytoarchitecture. So there's no way to do a individual specific cytoarchitectonic parcellation. You can do an individual specific parcellation based on sulci and gyri, but you cannot do it based on cytoarchitecture because you cannot see it in the scans. People have been creating lately what are called probabilistic cytoarchitecture maps. And what that is they take the cortex in a standard space, and there are 2 standard spaces that are used for cortex that you'll hear a ton about. One is MNI, or Montreal Neurological Institute coordinates. That's the one we'll use almost exclusively. Talairac coordinates is another term that's used for a different, technically it's a different type of map, but they both are meant to do the same thing, and they're roughly the same. They specify relative to a central landmark in the brain, how many millimeters, to the left, up, and forward is a brain region, and it's a 3D, so it has a coordinate, a 3D coordinate, and every portion of the cortical surface can have one in an individual. What a probabilistic atlas is one that says, okay, we'll take that average, so you can get an average. So MNI represents kind of an average brain of everybody. You can take that average brain, and for every point in that MNI space, you can say, all right, 70% chance this is Brodmann's area 4, because we had 100 dead brains and we looked at it and we mapped it, and So that, I don't believe they have the whole brain done yet, but there are groups, there's a lot of work in Germany, for example, being done on this. These areas in particular now have been a focus, these inferior frontal areas that are very variable across individuals. And it turns out that Brodmann's areas, so Brodmann breaks the inferior frontal gyrus up into 3, 44, 45, 47. And if you're interested in why they number them, the numbering has to do with if you start slicing at the very top of the brain, you slice the brain all the way down. The first one you hit is area 1. The second one you hit is area 2, and so forth. So 44, 45 are further down. That's how they're named, generally speaking. But anyway, Amunds is the person, Katrine Amunds, is doing a ton of this sort of mapping. I forgot the name of the group overall. It's in Julish, Germany, or Julish, Julish. Anyway, they call it that, the Julish model. And they're trying to do that kind of probabilistic atlas so that people could do an imaging study and say, oh, this was most likely BA44. But almost nobody does that yet. Almost everybody either just gives the MNI coordinate and then throws it into, so there are tools that you give it an MNI coordinate, it spits out a name, an anatomical name. Unfortunately, there are several of them and they don't always use the same names, and depending on, there's some variability in that. Sometimes it's not that area in the person. That's what most people do. We and a few other people who so it takes a lot more work to do anything other than that. What we do is we use the sulci and gyri as anatomical landmarks to parcellate the cortex. You can do that on every subject. You can do it semi-automatically, but you got to go in and clean it up, and that's the part that takes a long time. But that gives you a more accurate feel for for where you are in the brain, and it's much more specific than the name you get for the MNI coordinate itself is still pretty meaningful, though, and that's very specific. So that is why people put MNI coordinates in their papers, or if I'm going to write papers, to put the peaks. And that not only is that important just for people to localize where they are, but then people can do meta-analyses on these peaks and look across 20 studies and just use all those peaks to figure out where the real common activation is, like the consistent activation is. Okay, so that's just general cortical stuff. This slide now shows, with our parcellation system, on the inflated cortical surface, brain activity from 116 subjects doing a very simple speech test. So either, most of these are single syllable production, reading a single syllable versus just looking at a blank screen. This is unsmoothed data. There are enough subjects here that we can get a pretty kind of accurate map, I would say, of where the main activity is during speech now. And it's quite consistent across studies. Like if you have 15 brains and you average the activity, it looks a lot like this pretty much every time. A single brain, on the other hand, is missing some of this. So maybe it's got activity up here, but then nothing in the middle, and then a little bit up here, and so forth. So there's variability within individuals. That individual, if you scan them multiple times, always looks the same pretty much, but there's individual variability in where these parts, these functional regions are represented. So the main regions that we see here are the precentral gyrus, the postcentral gyrus. These black spheres are meta-analysis coordinates for studies that did a meta-analysis of speech minus baseline. And so the black spheres are just superimposed on the activation from our study of 116 subjects. And the thing to note here is how well these line up, basically, that these are consistent regions that are found across pretty much all speech studies. All of those black dots fall in the areas that we see in this activation, with the exception of some down here in the lingual gyrus that are probably related to reading sentences and things like that, because some of these, so first of all, these are more visual areas in here. This is occipital cortex medial view. This stuff is probably related to vision, and these all came from a study that included sentences, the meta-analysis. So we're not going to pay much attention. So I'm going to ignore activity that's around here as if it's not even there for the remainder of the class, pretty much. Okay, so pre and procentral gyrus, we see the anterior insula is very active, especially in the left hemisphere, less so on the right. Inferior frontal gyrus is active more so on the left usually than the right. Over here we only see a little bit of inferior frontal gyrus. The superior temporal gyrus is active bilaterally, pretty much symmetrically. This Heschel's gyrus, HG, this in here, is the primary auditory cortex. It, of course, is active during speech because you hear yourself. And then the activity in the temporal lobe goes into the what's called the superior temporal sulcus. So the superior temporal gyrus inferiorly is delineated by the superior temporal sulcus, and the gyrus below it is called the middle temporal gyrus. Inside that sulcus, there's quite a bit of speech-related activity, and you can see that in particular on this in the right hemisphere in this image. So those are the lateral areas that are most important. This spot up here in the sensory motor cortex is breathing related most likely. So it shows up if you have enough subjects. It's distinct from everything else. It appears to be related to breathing, but that, you know, that's what exactly it's doing during breathing. I mean, speech, you have to control your breath very accurately in combination with the larynx. And sometimes you see studies that claim that there's a larynx representation up there too, but that's probably because they were doing the voicing task, which required breathing control. Okay, so that's a lateral surface. Oh, one other thing is this up here in the parietal lobe. This is called the intraparietal sulcus, so intra meaning within, and it's a big sulcus that separates the superior and inferior parietal lobes. In that sulcus, you see some speech-related activity that is probably related to a couple of things. One is reading, and the other is working memory. This area is kind of a general working memory area. So we'll see it again in a lot of our images, but for this class, we'll mostly treat this as probably, until we get into the working memory part of this class, we'll treat this as reading related, most likely, not directly related to controlling the speech articulations. Okay, then the medial surface, there are three key areas: the supplementary area, motor area, the pre-supplementary motor area, and the cingulate motor area. The cingulate motor area is part of the cingulate and anterior cingulate cortex. But this, we're going to call it the cingulate motor area. It's a more specific term because of its involvement in motor tasks. We usually see two peaks, one in the cingulate area and then one right on the border of SMA and pre-SMA in speech. And so when I talk about the function of those, I'll talk about them as having distinct functions, but interestingly enough, the main activity you see there is right on the border, spanning both sides as a single focus. Okay. All right, so now we're, for the rest of the lecture, going to talk about the areas that are active in speech. One other thing I should point out is that this is just normal speech, but it turns out if you perturb auditory feedback during speech, more stuff lights up. And if you perturb somatosensory feedback, more stuff lights up. And that highlights an important thing, which is normally when adults are speaking, feedback control is hardly contributing at all because they're so good at speaking already. They don't make errors. But if you perturb their speech auditorily or somatosensorily, you cause errors, and suddenly you invoke their feedback control systems, and they show up as areas in addition. Some of them are in addition. A lot of it's areas you see here, but a lot of it's in addition. So for example, this supramarginal gyrus area that doesn't look very active here is actually quite active if you perturb the jaw suddenly. So it's some somatosensory thing involved in the somatosensory control of the jaw, most likely. And in right frontal cortex becomes much more active if you perturb speech also. We'll talk about left premotor areas as being more involved in feed-forward control, and right premotor areas around here being more involved in feedback control, sensory feedback-based control. And next week we'll unpack that.
Those areas right lit up.
Unknown still, because you can't. Nobody's successful. The problem with infants in MRI, so PET, that's completely out because of radioactive tracers. fMRI, they can't sit still long enough, so they have to be sleeping, and they're not speaking during that period. So there are no good fMRI studies I know of that capture, 3 years or younger speech. I will throw out a prediction out there. My prediction is that these plus a lot more, especially in the right hemisphere, are going to be active in kids because they're having to do a lot more feedback control all the time, just because they're more variable speech-wise. So probably they're going to have more overall activity. And I bet if you look in kids, it looks more bilateral in the premotor cortex, whereas adults, it's more left lateralized in the premotor cortex. But that's just me. Okay, so let's move forward. So the best understood of these areas for speech are the probably the precentral gyrus and to a lesser degree postcentral gyrus, but these are very much the same in monkeys and humans, with the exception of speech articulator representations, which are much, much bigger in humans. And the Rolandic cortex, as I said, also sometimes called sensory motor cortex, it includes both precentral and postcentral gyri. And why is it called Rolandic cortex? And why is Roland, Roland is correct. There might be an even more precise answer. What's this sulcus called? Yeah, the central sulcus is also called the Rolandic sulcus. So, but all of them are, of course, named after Roland. So. He was a neuroanatomist a million years ago. I believe he's English, but I'm not positive. I don't know a lot about him. It's also sometimes called the fissure of Roland. Central fissure. Sadly, you have to memorize all of them because you never know which one somebody's going to use. All right. So the postcentral gyrus is usually called primary somatosensory cortex, and it has 3 Brodmann's areas, 1, 2, and 3. And they differ in the combination of types of afferents, afferents being the inputs from the periphery. They receive tactile and proprioceptive input from the opposite side of the body, the contralateral side of the body. Unlike motor cortex, this is almost complete and involves the speech articulators as well, meaning that in the speech articulators, sensory cortex is very lateralized, but actually in the motor cortex, the speech articulators, because they're midline structures, are more bilaterally represented. So damage to motor cortex only gives you on one side, doesn't really mess you up much. Damaging somatosensory cortex on one side can cause some paralysis in the contralateral side of the body because it's you don't have as much input to the you don't really get that much. You don't get much input to the other side, so you rely on what's in that hemisphere. So I don't remember the details of which one. I believe BA1 is mostly tactile information. BA2 is mostly proprioceptive information, and BA3 has more combination. And actually in here, there's also a secondary somatosensory cortex some people talk about. And sometimes this bottom part is separated off of the precentral gyrus. It's called the operculum, in this case, the parietal operculum or Rolandic operculum. That cortex is sometimes considered a higher order somatosensory cortical area. But usually everybody just thinks of this as primary somatosensory cortex. And on top of all of that, the distinction between primary and secondary is way more binarized than the reality. The reality is it's a kind of continuously changing thing, and the same thing is true of premotor and primary motor cortex, as we'll see. So it doesn't really matter if people call this S2 or secondary somatosensory cortex or whatever. That doesn't really give you much more information beyond and above. It's in the postcentral gyrus. The speech articulators are represented there. Here I'm showing the speech articulators. This is from a less famous figure from Penfield, and this is Penfield and Roberts. This is speech and brain mechanisms. And this one shows the precentral gyrus, which has the primary motor cortex, which is Brodmann's area 4, and premotor cortex, which is Brodmann's area 6. The primary motor cortex is the part closest to the central sulcus, and the premotor cortex is in front of it. Primary motor cortex has neurons that connect quite directly to the periphery. So for example, there are neurons in here that go directly to the brainstem neurons that control speech articulators. So this is a direct cortical connection, one synapse connection. As you move forward, there are fewer and fewer cells that have direct connections and more cells that actually have indirect connections through primary motor cortex. And that cortex with fewer projections directly to the periphery is called premotor cortex. And we'll see that the cell properties are different as well. They get more complicated as you move forward. And they get further, so they start in the central sulcus as very, very body specific. And as you go forward in the motor cortex, they become more and more related to the task space. So for speech, I'm going to say that that's something like a formant space. So for arm movements, for example, if you look at primary motor cortex cells, they are very directly related to the muscles, and they care very much about movement direction and muscle space. But if you look at, imagine this task. I have a monkey who learned how to move a mouse, and he has to do a cursor moving on the screen, and he has to do it two ways. One way, the cursor goes normally, as we always do it. But in another condition, it's opposite. So the cursor moves in opposite direction. So that dissociates movement on the screen direction from movement of the hand direction. Alexander and Crutcher did a series of experiments in the 90s looking at the cell properties in these in premotor and motor cortex as you go more further forward in the monkey's motor cortex in the hand area. And what you see is in the posterior part, the most primary motor cortex parts, you see cells that care only about the direction of movement of the mouse. They care only about the arm, where the arm is moving in arm space. As you go forward, you get more and more, a higher and higher percentage of cells that don't care about that, but instead they care about which direction it moves on the screen. And so there's like two gradients, one of motoric things and one of task-based things, that as you move along, more anterior in the cortex, you're becoming more task space and less motor space. That's very roughly speaking. And I believe that to be true of speech. That's been shown to be true for arm movements in monkeys. In speech, it's more controversial still, but we were able to verify, and I'll show a slide in a bit, that there is in fact a representation of the formant frequencies in the premotor part of the speech cortex. So that backs up the idea that you can, that first of all, the task space is being represented there as you get more into premotor cortex. And secondly, that formant frequencies are at least one way to characterize that task space that are somewhat dissociated from the musculature, as much as task. Okay, I mentioned that motor cortex efferents, the outputs of motor cortex, are pretty much bilateral for speech. So if somebody went in and could very precisely lesion your left hemisphere primary motor cortex and not premotor, you'd still be fine pretty much. Or, I mean, especially if they did it on the right. In the right, there would be very little, there's a little bit of weakness on the contralateral side maybe, but it's pretty much normal because the projections are largely bilateral. That's different from the periphery we talked about last week. If you get damaged, or 2 weeks ago, to the brainstem nuclei that control movements of muscles, you damage them on one side, you're paralyzed on that side. So cortex, it's not that way. So the cortex is much more malleable than the periphery in this case, even in primary motor cortex, that's true. Okay, so a couple of important things to know again about these. They're highly interconnected with each other, and that makes a ton of sense. That's why, in part, that the body representations line up so well, because they're very, very interconnected. They're highly interconnected with the basal ganglia and the cerebellum through the pons, and the anterior insula, this part up here, which seems to play one or more roles in speech production, we'll talk about, as well as prefrontal and parietal regions, so neighboring regions. And generally speaking, every part of cortex is highly interconnected with stuff around it. That's true throughout the entire cortex. So in some ways, what's more meaningful are the things that are far away that you're connected to, because that shows you more about what's important for your brain area. Of course, the stuff around you is important. Every area shows that, but if you look at a connectivity map of where inferior frontal gyrus connects to, and there's a set of them in the appendix C of the book, you'll see that in addition to what's around it in these areas, the pre-SMA and SMA and the medial surface are heavily interconnected with it, even though they're way away in terms of cortical real estate. So obviously those the interactions between those brain regions are very important. And so we'll look at cortical connectivity on and off throughout as well to try to infer what regions form functional networks across different parts of the cortex. One other factoid about the cortex, so that you don't get too versed in thinking of it as motor and somatosensory. In monkeys, if you excise on both sides just the primary motor cortex, a little bit of weakness, but no full paralysis, even though you did both sides. If you just do the somatosensory cortex, a little bit of loss of sensation, but still pretty normal. If, on the other hand, you do both primary and somatosensory on just one side, complete paralysis and loss of sensation on the other side. And so what that shows is that motor cortex actually does a lot of somatosensory type stuff too. So if you cut out the somatosensory cortex, motor cortex still has enough input from the periphery, somatosensory periphery, to do its job, to be able to handle losing somatosensory cortex. Similarly, somatosensory cortex seems to have motor neurons in it as well. So neurons that project to the periphery and that can actuate movement of the limb, even though the primary motor cortex is completely gone. So premotor motor, that's very much a continuum, but even something as fundamental functionally as motor versus somatosensory, it's actually more of a continuum there too than a very solid breakdown. And as I mentioned, this is supposedly one of the most kind of best delineated cytoarchitecture regions in the brain, and still the function across the two sides of that boundary are they can take over for each other. So when I show a parcellation like this, I'm basically parcellating up a very continuous thing into discrete units, just so it's easier to talk about them, more or less, or model them. Okay. Oh, and the last thing is that speech articulators, as most of you know by now, I think, are in this ventral part of the Rolandic cortex. And there is some topography there, as we'll see here. So this slide, this is from the stimulation studies of Penfield Roberts in the 40s and 50s. This slide is fMRI data, and what I did, and this is appendix 1 of the book, this is where I got all those studies of individual articulator movements, so studies that involve just moving the jaw, or just moving the lips, or just moving the tongue, etc. I took all of the recorded points and all of the studies that were done, so all of the peaks in M and I coordinates or Talairac that people mentioned, and just plotted them on in the same brain space. And so what this shows is, across studies, where did they find the representation of each articulator? And a couple of things should become clear. One is that they overlap a ton. They talk about this map as if it's very distinct and discrete. It is not. Another thing is, even in the same study, they'll find different subregions for a given articulator. So sometimes you'll find an upper and a lower larynx representation. Actually, very often you'll find upper and lower larynx representations. And sometimes you'll find, by upper, I mean upper in the superior sense in the brain structure. Similarly, sometimes you'll see two-tone representations in a particular subject. They seem to have two, that's broken down. And most likely, if you could do it in a fine enough grain, they're all broken, like all subjects are probably broken down like that. I think the reason is you want those articulators to be intermingled, especially articulators that are going to be controlled together. So jaw, tongue, and lips, they have to be super, super coordinated. They're all represented down here in this ventral part in overlapping representations. Very roughly, you can say that the larynx in this part is more superior than the jaw. The jaw is more ventral. The tongue is pretty ventral as well. The lips are a little bit above and behind it, but there's still, a ton of overlap in them. And so it's a mirage to think of it as a very strict hierarchy of location along the motor cortex, even though a lot of people talk about it that way. That said, there is some degree of topography, and the most notable part is that the respiratory stuff, which is the brown stuff, is all way up here. So these are studies that have people do controlled breathing or breathe in an environment that causes them to have to breathe more, harder, like pressing the chest or something like that. Those studies tend to show activation primarily in the dorsal part of the Rolandic cortex, and that's different from the rest of the articulators. You do occasionally see larynx there, as I mentioned, but that's probably because it's a phonation task that breathing was happening as well, and they just thinking of that as an articulator task. So down here, I show meta-analysis results. So it's basically taking all these peaks and doing a computational meta-analysis. And the black ones are from the speech meta-analyses I mentioned before. And what you see are the speech ones are exactly where a whole bunch of other articulators are represented together. Again, highlighting that for speech, you want parts of cortex where all the articulators are close by in representation, because those are going to be the most heavily interconnected, and those are going to be the ones you can coordinate the best. And so, for example, in the arm area, you see a bunch of hand and arm cells intermingled with each other, along with some that care about elbow and some that care about shoulder. That's all intermingled closely together, presumably because you have to control all those things together when you're doing reaching. So speech across the board in areas that are involved in individual articulator movements, the speech representation is in the area where they're most convergent together. And that's covered in that example. So, okay, so we'll focus on these ventral parts. And normally we're not going to try to figure out exactly which articulator is being represented. When we see activation down there, we're just going to think of it as activation of speech articulators. Okay. One term, so this thing I mentioned where for a speech, for example, you have the jaw and the lips and the tongue all represented right near each other, even though also there are a lot of tongue things near each other. If the property of the cortical surface matching the body surface, meaning that things that are nearby each other on the skin are nearby in the cortex, that's referred to as somatotopy. The property that, although that is true, that there are then suddenly a bunch of jaw where they're right next to the lip and things like that. For that reason, they use the term fractured somatotopy to describe this type of representation. So unlike in the visual system where there's a very beautiful, clear-cut, non-violated map of retinal location and primary visual cortex, here it's not this smooth. It's a little bit more discretized with different muscles intermingled with each other in the cortical representation. And that's what fractured. Okay. A lot is known about motor cortical neurons more generally. We are going to look first at what's known in arm movement domain, and a ton is known in arm movement domain because monkeys can move their arms, and they can teach them to do all kinds of tasks. And their arm area of cortex is quite similar to our arm area of cortex in location and size and presumably function. And so a lot of stuff has been done, and two main tasks are used for this. Isometric tasks, where basically there's a manipulandum that doesn't move, but it measures forces, and the monkey's supposed to push on it to move the cursor forward and pull on it to move the cursor back, something like that. Those are called isometric tasks, since nothing moves, but forces are being adjusted. That type of task is very common for the most primary of the primary motor cortex cells, because those cells are the ones that are most force related. I mentioned that as you go from the central sulcus forward, you go from muscle related to task space related. There's also a gradient from force related or remember I talked about inverse dynamics, where forces are very important, and then kinematics, where forces aren't, it's just movements. That also has a gradient where, again, the ones closest to the central sulcus, the ones that project the motor neurons, they have to care more about force, because force plays a big role in what you're doing in the muscles. But as you move forward, especially in the premotor areas, they become more and more kinematic. They care more about movement and don't care about force. So they'll fire the same, even if the arm is being pulled towards something as opposed to being pushed towards something. Whereas a force-related cell would fire the opposite for those two conditions. People have done very nice experiments to kind of dissociate those two things. And you see that each of the neurons has a tuning curve of something it prefers, a movement direction usually that it prefers. And some of them are modulated by the force and some of them are not. And so there are purely force related, they're purely kinematic, and then there's everything in between. And that's just the way it is with cortex. So again, not really there are always these continua going from one area to another, not strict boundaries. As I mentioned, some of the neurons project directly to the motor neurons and the cranial nerves and the spinal cord. Some of the longest axons in the brain are for controlling legs and feet, for example, because they have to go from the primary motor cortex, one axon all the way down your spine to the motor neurons that control the movements of the legs and feet. That's like 3 feet long in some people. Those are the longest axons we have. They're not actually the biggest neurons. We'll talk about the biggest neurons, although they're amongst the biggest neurons. These motor cortical neurons that have to fire and send those signals right down. The ones in motor cortex that are directly connected to the periphery are often called corticomotor neurons, to highlight that they're very tightly connected to the muscles, more or less. So motoneuron is the neuron controlling the muscle movement. And we talked about the lower motor neurons being the ones in the brainstem. These are upper motor neurons, but corticomotor neurons, that term usually means part of motor cortex that projects directly to the periphery. As you move rostrally or anteriorly in the precentral gyrus, they become more sensitive to displacement and less sensitive to force. So that's what I was saying, kinematics versus dynamics. Also, they tend to code external task-based or task-based variables like spatial movement directions rather than internal muscle variables. Okay. A lot has been done also on the types of individual neurons in motor cortex. Even in the same area of motor cortex, even in the same small compartment of it, you'll find different firing properties. And what I'm showing here are some kind of classic firing property shapes as a function of time for simple movements. And these movements are typically reaching. For this, they're reaching movements. So in this case, the manipulandum that the monkey holds actually moves, and it's usually what's called the center out or out center task. Center out task is the monkey starts in the middle. There are 8 locations, each of which has a light that the monkey can see. When the light goes on, the monkey's supposed to move to that location. That's the center out task. Those tasks have shown that each of the neurons, especially in the more primary areas, tends to have a preferred direction of movement. A neuron will like going forward, say, and will hate going backward, and so it'll be inhibited when you move this way. You would expect that from the muscles, because a muscle that moves you one way has to be turned off when you move in the opposite direction, generally speaking. And so in addition to this preference in spatial movement direction, sometimes for world space, sometimes for internal variables, depending on where you are, there's the temporal profiles, and they tend to fall into these classes. So before we go into the classes, think about what you need to do to move your arm from point A to point B. Your muscles are all still. You need to start moving them, and that means you need to give like a burst of activity to start, and then you need to control the velocity of the muscle, meaning you need to control how fast it contracts, and that velocity profile ends up looking a lot like this. So this looks like a early version of the velocity profile that you see at the periphery. And so this is probably a velocity-related cell. It's probably controlling muscle velocities. And the movement itself is, of course, when there is a velocity, otherwise it's not movement. And you go from a starting point where you have to hold the arm in one position, so one set of tonic muscle activities. to another position with another set of tonic muscle activities. And when I say tonic, I mean activity that stays fairly constant over time. So you would expect if there are neurons that are controlling the length of the muscle, that they would look something like these tonic cells, where they'd start out at one position, and then when you move, they move to another tonic position, and now they're holding the arm in this new position. So these tonic cells tend to look like what you might expect. And these ramp cells look a lot like that as well. They don't jump as quickly, so these seem like you've got one configuration and then you just turn it off and you turn on another one. But in actuality, the movement's more slow, and these tend to more track the movement, these ramp cells. So they tend to gradually go from the one position to the other position. That explains these three. This type is called, they're phasic onset cells. They call them onset because they only come up very quickly at the very beginning of the movement, and they're off then. So a basic one is called the phasic reaction time cell, which it starts in the reaction time and it ends early when the movement starts. But then there are combinations, so phasic ramp. So a cell that has a bump of activity, but then it goes back down and it does a more of a ramp thing, and a phasic tonic, and so forth. And all of this stuff tells you a lot about what the control variables are in a task, because it looks like velocity is very important. It looks like position is important. It looks like position is controlled in two different ways, with some cells quickly jumping to the new position where the others slowly ramp to that new position. You actually see big bursts in motor neurons oftentimes at the very beginning of the movement. And when you start a movement, there is inertia trying to keep you still, so you have to overcome that to get the movement going. You can think of those burst cells as kind of starting that movement. And so this kind of breakdown has been very valuable in the arm movement literature for understanding the details of what's happening in these cells. In speech, we're not quite there yet, although we, in our lab, we did a recent paper, and there are a couple other papers out there on shapes from ECOG. So ECOG is measuring on the cortical surface. It's measuring thousands of neurons, but you do still get some characteristic shapes. You don't get this kind of detail, but you do see things that ramp and other things that seem to jump up and back down more quickly. And so I think, over the next 20 years in the speech literature, especially as more cases of single neuron recordings occur during surgery and so forth, we'll start getting a better feel for what those variables look like in speech. But it's probably a good guess that you'll see cell types that are similar to this. It's just that they'll be operating in an acoustic sort of space related to the articulators rather than a 2D or 3D space relative to the. Okay. As I mentioned, Georgopoulos and colleagues in particular are the ones that showed that there is a preferred direction of movement in 2D or 3D space. And in a paper we did with a locked-in patient that had microelectrodes that we could record single units from, and to my knowledge is the only recordings of single unit recordings from the speech cortex so far, we were able to verify that you get a similar thing, except the preferred directions are represented in a formant space, or at least they can be represented. So here, this slide indicates for all the neurons that we had that cared about formant direction, which direction in the F1, F2 plane they preferred. So some neurons like to go up, increase F1 and decrease F2, for example. And there were neurons that span the whole space. The length of the arrow here is just how strongly tuned it is, like how much it cares, like how much does its activity change for movements in that direction versus other directions. This slide shows what's called the tuning curve. This shows the firing preference of every neuron. So each of these arrows on the bottom represents a different movement direction in this F1, F2 space. And this particular neuron, this is its firing curve. So for this movement direction, it's actually inhibited significantly, and for this one. But for the opposite movement direction, it fires maximally. So it fires maximally for this movement direction right here, down into the right. So increasing F1, decreasing F2 is what this neuron cares the most about. And as movements get further and further away from that, it cares less and less. It fires less and less. And movements in the opposite direction in formant space, it actually gets inhibited. So this is just one piece of evidence, but it suggests at least that there's probably a similar sort of organization to the primary motor cortex for hand movements in monkeys except that the task space here is now something like an acoustic task space, format space. Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break now, and then workshop afterwards. Anybody have any questions on motor cortex before we break? Please relax and enjoy yourselves. Yep. Yeah, so we analyze on the cortical surface. As you most likely know, you can either do it in the volume or the cortical surface. And the advantage of the cortical surface is huge for speech because so much of the stuff is in the sulci. And those two, so like precentral and postcentral gyri, or actually the worst is the parietal cortex and the temporal cortex are right next to each other. And so if you use a box base, you'll smooth across that boundary. That's what the main reason we use the cortical surface is to avoid smoothing across sulci. It's pretty cool areas. Yeah, yep. And occasionally some people from our lab take workshop. Yeah, yeah. The people who developed that software, most of them went to BU for computational neuroscience. I went to school with a bunch of them. Blue Social, yeah, there were others. John Paul. Yeah, he was one of them. I was Bruce Fisher's advisor. No, have you spoken to this thing? Okay.
It was
Yeah, we work with frontal temporal dementia. Oh, okay. Yeah, they've been using it.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, we just send over more stations definitions to them. So conversation with a friend that is not involved to just using Google response every time. We want to see if you go do it enough, is it going to come up with something crazy. It gets pretty boring. There's a lot, but I agree. What it sounds like a plan. tends to go from your very specific conversation to, oh, that sounds great. Pretty quickly. So I think it's just going to be a change. I think it's probably just going to end up with I agree.
Throw in just one thing. Just I agree.
Yeah.
At least you brought in them for everything.
Yes. No, these are all for me. Welcome to some choosing.
That was not successful. Should we start? I know we have 2 or 3 minutes. All right. Next stop is the medial premotor cortex, otherwise known as the supplementary motor areas. The big confusing part of these terms, other than medial premotor cortex means the same thing as supplementary motor areas, is that supplementary motor areas actually mean something slightly different than supplementary motor area. And historically, this has become, this is because there used to just be one supplementary motor area, which was this whole area up here. And then electrophysiologists determined that, in fact, they do different things and they have different connectivity and so forth. And so they broke it up into SMA proper, or just SMA, and pre-SMA. Your problem as a reader of the literature is that some people are going to use SMA to mean both of these, especially in earlier papers, like any paper written before 1990 is very likely to just call this supplementary motor area. Others are going to separate them, and more is the more modern the paper, more recent the paper, the more you'll see them separated into SMA proper, or just SMA, and pre-SMA. When I say supplementary motor areas, I mean both of them. Otherwise, I mean the SMA proper when I say SMA in this class. So I'll always distinguish pre-SMA from SMA, unless I'm referring to both of them. Okay, so these are part of Brodmann's area 6. They're actually just medial to the dorsalmost part of the premotor cortex on the lateral surface. So if you go over the top of the cortex into the lateral surface, from SMA, this is the precentral gyrus. When you go over, SMA is just in front of that. And it actually pretty much ends on this margin here between the medial and lateral surface. So you get some activity at the very top that you might see in fMRI, even without an inflated brain. But generally speaking, most of the activity, for speech at least, involving SMA and pre-SMA is inside this interhemispheric sulcus, and therefore you don't really see it much on a normal brain image. You either need to look at slices, or, as we'll do in this class, look at inflated brains with the medial surface pulled out like this. Okay, they're both Brodmann's area 6, but they have different connectivity. So the SMA is more motoric, and the pre-SMA is more probably sequencing working memory, but they're very heavily interconnected with each other. And so, as we see on the lateral surface, pre-SMA can kind of be thought of as a higher order area that ties in with working memory that then probably has a role in activating SMA cells, which then are more motoric. They're more related to turning on movements. There's a rough topography up here, and the speech articulators for SMA are in the anterior part, and for pre-SMA they're in the posterior part, and that's why when we see speech blobs, it spans both of these, but we'll talk about them as if they're different. Again, it's a continuum probably, but definitely the more anterior part of that is doing something different than the more posterior part, and we'll talk about that as we break down the cell fragments. Okay, so SMA, the motoric one, is very heavily interconnected with the putamen, which is part of the, more specifically, part of Yes. And so that's where the basal ganglia gets a lot of input about motor context, as we talked about, and perhaps it's through this basal ganglia loop with SMA that speech movements are initiated, and that's the way it is in the DIVA model. It's still somewhat theoretical and not fully verified, but there is a lot of evidence supporting that view. And so basically, we'll take the view in this class that SMA, through interactions with the basal ganglia, is more or less responsible for initiating a motor program, for turning on the motor program, but not for all the little details in the motor program itself. That's going to be the lateral cortex that carries out that. Pre-SMA is more heavily interconnected with prefrontal cortex areas. Prefrontal cortex means all of the frontal cortex that's in front of premotor cortex. So frontal cortex can be thought of as three parts: primary motor, premotor, prefrontal. Prefrontal has language areas, working memory areas, cognitive control areas, the highest consciously available aspects of our experience, our prefrontal cortex. So pre-SMA is more tied in with those things. In particular, it seems crucial in working memory, in all kinds of working memory tests, phonological, non-phonological. It just seems very important for working memory tasks, and it also seems very important for sequencing. So, for example, if you teach a monkey to do a sequence of 3 movements, push, pull, turn, you'll find cells in premotor cortex that only fire for push, pull, turn sequences and not any other sequence, even if it uses those same movements in a different mode. Whereas in SMA, you'll find cells that mostly code one movement regardless of what sequence it's in. But of course, there's a continuum of cells. Okay, so SMA is bilaterally activated during speech production with very little, if any, bias. Maybe a tiny left bias, maybe not. But they're not identical in importance, the left and right hemispheres. And in particular, if you transect, which means cut out, the SMA on one side, SMAs in this case, they usually do both pre-SMA and SMA, which they will do for certain surgeries. If you do that on the right side, nothing happens motorically. If you do it on the left side, there's a brief period of mutism often. And you can also get what's called transcortical motor aphasia, which is a kind of complex aphasia, which involves reduced self-initiated speech. You may recall that I talked about how motivation to speak comes from the cingulate area. The cingulate motor area is immediately below the pre-SMA. And so it could be that your desire, your motivation to speak, it comes from here, it goes through the SMA, pre-SMA, and that's how the movements are generated. And if you cut these out on the left, then you get a transient mutism. If you cut all of this out, including the CMA on both sides, you get permanent mutism. It's called akinetic mutism. People just don't move, they have no affect. They can do some automatic things. So even in this temporary version, if you just transect the left SMA, pre-SMA, they still, yell out expletives when they bump their toes and things like that. If you start counting the days of the week, they might be able to continue on, but they just don't generate their own speech, which is kind of an odd thing. Like they just don't, it seems as if they don't want to talk, basically. They may be able to, but they just don't try. So there's no sign, like if your damage is in the left lateral cortex, frontal cortex, it's obvious that you're trying to speak. If it's in the medial cortex, it's like you don't care, you just don't want to speak, almost, or like you don't realize that you should be speaking. So a very different thing, and it could be that it's because the paralimbic cortex here, the cingulate motor area, is very much interconnected with these pre-SMA areas. So anyway, if you excise the left SMA, pre-SMA, you get transient mutism that lasts for about a month usually, but almost always clears up. If you do the right side, you don't even get the transient mutism. So it appears that the left side is more important for speech initiation, but that the right side can probably take that job over time, or if it's not that, it's areas around it that are taking the job over time. That's different from the lateral area. So if you damage the lateral areas in the left, you get lasting apraxia of speech if it happens in an adult. Whereas if it's just the SMA, pre-SMA, you only get temporary problems. The lateral areas, meaning that the lateral areas are more, the lateral areas are more lateralized, but using lateralized in the sense of left versus right. That makes sense. Confusing. Okay. As I said, SMA is more motoric. Activity, let's see. Okay. Yep. So okay, and yeah, so we will think of the SMA in this class, SMA proper, as being initiation oriented primarily. Pre-SMA is more involved in sequencing, possibly in the metrical structure of an utterance. So prosody involves intonation profile, but it also involves metrical structure, like how long do I drag out a syllable, or when do I start the next word? Do I pause in between? Those are all prosodic clues that have often linguistic consequences. And those, I think at least, are probably involving the pre-SMA a lot, because I think of it as being, it knows the set of phonemes coming up, and it knows it's representing how you want them to be dragged out. Like, do you want to stress a syllable by making the vowel last longer? Probably pre-SMA by some, I think. But that's how we'll discuss in the class, but that is pretty speculative. Like, I don't know how many people would agree with that opinion. Most people wouldn't have an opinion on it in the speech literature, but in the primate literature, there may be more. And there's actually very limited evidence for this metrical structure in terms of fMRI studies that show more activity there. So it's not that simple. Do keep in mind, though, that the pre-SMA and SMA are both very, very heavily interconnected with the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is very important for this same sequencing stuff. So possibly most of that is being done in the basal ganglia in the adult system. It's unclear, but in any case, it is pretty clear that the pre-SMA is less tied to particular articulations than the SMA, and both of them have less detail about the movements than the lateral primary motor and premotor cortex. It is likely, and although not entirely agreed upon, that supplementary motor areas are more involved in feed-forward control, meaning reading out learned motor programs, as opposed to reacting to sensory errors that you detect. It does not become very active at all for perturbation experiments, but keep in mind those are contrasting perturbed speech with unperturbed speech, both of which have pre-SMA activity during them. It's just it doesn't really go up much for the perturbed case. So it may well be involved in feedback control as well. It's definitely involved in feed-forward control, though, and as evidenced by the fact that when you damage it, you don't read out any motor programs at all. And when you do speak in these, one other thing to add is if you transect these areas or you get damage to these medial areas, when you do speak, it still sounds right. It's, you don't have a dysarthria like you do when you have damage to the laterals, or not as much of it. So again, highlighting that it's more about motivation and turning on speech than controlling the detailed muscle activations of speech in these medial areas. Okay, the next area is just below it. It's a cingulate motor area. I mentioned earlier that this is the cingulate gyrus, this gyrus in the medial cortex that wraps around. So this is the corpus callosum. This is a big fiber pathway across the two hemispheres, and the cingulate gyrus is just above it. Posterior cingulate, not involved in speech. Anterior cingulate is, and in particular, the cingulate motor area, which is a sub-region of the cingulate cortex, is reliably activated in speech. In animals, this cingulate cortex in the Jorgen's primate vocalization model I talked about goes to the periaqueductal gray matter and was involved in the emotive and motivational aspects of speaking. In humans, it also goes to the subcortical structures, but in addition, it goes into the cortical control circuitry, the SMA and pre-SMA in particular. CMA, as I mentioned before, is part of the paralimbic system, so it's kind of in between the subcortical structures like the amygdala and other structures involved in emotion and in motivation. And it's between that limbic system and the neocortex, which has all the detailed calculations going on, again, suggesting a role in motivational or kind of modulating speech rather than representing the individual motor programs, and a more, I would say, more likely tied in with the motivation and emotion system than the SMA and pre-SMA. So this is probably the region that if you had to pick a place in the brain that was related to motivation to speak, it would probably be CMA. That would be my choice. In humans, there are actually two different cytoarchitectonic regions in CMA. We're not going to worry about the distinction between them, but they're BA24 and BA32. And some of these, I believe at least one of these does not occur. If you have unilateral to damage to CMA, you don't really get speech problems, but bilateral damage, especially if it includes pre-SMA, SMA, can cause akinetic mutism, which is what I just talked about. You don't talk. You otherwise are fine. You can stick out your tongue. You can do lots of stuff. You just choose not to talk, or you're not motivated. And it's not just talking. There's plenty of other movements that you don't do as well. So it basically seems to be all in keeping with the idea that you've lost the ability to motivate yourself, get the motivation to speak is not there, and therefore you don't try, your lateral cortical areas don't become active, and behaviorally that's, you don't try to speak, basically. I believe writing would also, so usually these are big lesions, so they would cover all of the motor subsystems involved. So I would think it's very likely that writing does not work. They may understand language, though, but that I don't know for sure. Like that, I believe they probably do understand when people say stuff to them, but it does not translate into them. They can't translate it. So even if I told them, you tell them, raise your hand, they will continue staring. Okay, as I mentioned, Jorgens and monkeys suggest that it's actually, Jorgens in this paper suggested in humans, it's probably involved in the readiness to express oneself vocally, based primarily on his studies in non-human primates. If you electrically stimulate it in monkeys, you get species-specific emotive vocalizations. As I mentioned, monkeys have a kind of a repertoire of calls that they use, all of which seem to be tied in with some sort of mental state or emotional state. You can actually get some of them to come out in monkeys, probably because there are more powerful connections from CMA to the periphery, to the pad in general, the periaqueductive gray matter, which is that area that has to be activated to gate vocalization. In humans, on the other hand, nothing happens if you stimulate CMA. And in fact, that's true of a huge amount of cortex. So a little trivia thing in here, cocktail party conversation. You know the old adage, you only use 10% of your brain? Yeah, it's wrong. For starters. But it comes from the stimulation studies where actually stimulating the vast majority of cortex does absolutely nothing that you can notice in a person. Only if you stimulate the primary motor areas, or if there happen to be, so probably it does something, and if they happen to be doing just exactly the task it's involved in, then you'd see a deficit. But for the most part, they see nothing. So they go in, they stimulate a bunch of areas, the ones that cause movements, they stay away from during surgery, the ones that interrupt speech, they stay away from during surgery, but the rest of it is like, and you can cut out a lot of that, and again, not much deficit. So that led to the kind of folk belief that 90% of your brain, technically it should be cortex, but 90% of your brain isn't being used. at least according to one attempt to try to figure out where that came from. But I assure you, you're using all of it. It's just unclear what it's doing. A lot of it is very specific stuff, though. Another, anecdote along those lines is, I don't know if you've heard of colostomies, where they go in and they cut the corpus callosum in half, and that it's millions and millions, if not a billion fibers going between the hemispheres. And it took years before they found any deficits whatsoever. People seem perfectly the same, to the point where people, like surgeons, made jokes about how it's like structurally to hold the cortex up or something. Only when they started doing things like show a horse in one visual hemifield and then have them write the answer with their opposite hand, then they can't do it. And like weird things like that, where it's split, like the sensory input is split. And in that case, it's probably because eventually most sensory input, most things make it up to both sides of the brain. And so both sides have information about what's going on. But in those cases, the visual system from one hemisphere doesn't get input from the ipsilateral hemisphere. And so it cannot see what's on the other side. And so that hemisphere cannot answer a question that's based just on what's happening in that visual hemisphere. But amazingly, there's very little in the way of behavioral problem. And this is why, for example, they can go in somebody with epilepsy and cut out several inches of cortex, and that person's still, almost perfectly functional. I mean, day to day, probably fine. I'm sure when they, difficult tasks are more difficult and so forth, there's something there, but the brain's very, very robust to a lot of that in a lot of areas. And CMA kind of falls into that, except for when it's damaged. You can have, if it's bilaterally damaged, then you can have serious mutism issues. Yeah, you would not know probably your entire life. And you probably aren't as good at sports, but plenty of people with corpus callosums are not good at sports. So who would have ever thought of it? You're probably actually better at certain things where you don't have an interfering factor going on, if you can find what those are. But again, it's another one of those things where, being born without it doesn't seem to cause that much problem. In this case, though, you can have the whole brain develop normally with the corpus callosum and then cut it out, and it still doesn't change much. Well, if you scan enough brains, you start seeing crazy stuff where you're like, how is this person even walking or whatever? And then you show it to a neurologist and they're like, that's not a big deal. They don't even contact the person. So, well, it's for epilepsy again. So sometimes the epilepsy moves across, it like kind of kindles bilaterally, and if you cut it out, you can stop it. And that's, I think, probably better than cutting out cortical tissue directly. But it's maybe exclusive, or maybe too there, but primarily for epilepsy. Okay. Enough content. The other thing that I think CMA, besides motivation, will play a role in most likely is affect. And affect is the emotional quality of voice. That has most to do with what's called voice quality, which means literally the vocal fold signal quality, not your speech quality. So if your vocal fold signal is very oscillatory, perfect on the right frequency, you sound perfectly fine. If, on the other hand, it warbles in its frequency, that's an emotional modulation that's occurring, and quite possibly is occurring through some CMA projections to the pattern and areas involved in voicing. So CMA may well play a role in emotional prosody or affective prosody.
Is that intentional or a result?
It probably plays it was already there in monkeys for it gives you, it's a way of communicating, even if, so monkeys know when other monkeys are distressed, for example, and we know when somebody's distressed often by their voice. So I think it's probably evolution because it doesn't, and it also rarely impacts intelligibility. You know, I mean, on the margins a little bit, but you still understand what people are saying. So it just gives you more information about the person. I could imagine there are many instances where you want to not have that happen. Also, like you don't want to know you're in battle, for example. Best not to know that other people know you're scared, something like that. But I bet that's outweighed just by the day-to-day communicative. Yeah, so nerves. Yeah. And that happens to people who aren't even, like, it continues happening to people, and it happens to me occasionally. Like if I didn't eat breakfast and I'm a little tired, my voice is wavering a little bit, and it's something about the situation because it's not wavering when I'm talking normally, but I'm not nervous. It's like a very kind of, you know, a subconscious thing that's happening, but it definitely gets way worse when you're really nervous. Like people give the first talks very often. That's the most you'll ever hear it because public speaking scares the crap out of a lot of people.
He's feeling better and he is less stressed, he's happy, whatever. He has those problems.
Yeah, and stuttering is the same way.
Exactly.
Yeah, stuttering, giving a talk is one of the, like public talk is one of the worst things for people who stutter, so they have to practice. So it's very automatic by the time they give the talk. But if they were saying those exact same things, you know, to a friend sitting there that they've known for a long time, it wouldn't be an issue. Talking on the phone, same sort of ups the stress a little. And sometimes that's the same voice quality. Some people who don't talk. All right. Okay, so now we're moving into the parietal cortex, and particularly the supramarginal gyrus. Supramarginal gyrus is immediately behind the postcentral gyrus. It is usually considered to be involved in a couple of things. One of them is higher order somatosensory representation, especially the vocal tract, because it's in the inferior part, the ventral part of behind the ventral part of the postcentral gyrus. It's also involved in working memory, especially up here in the interparietal sulcus. So this region, very dorsomost. I'm going to point up here and describe roughly the three of the main things. So this one, working memory, reading, related up here. Up here, somatosensory, higher order somatosensory, and then down here, where inside the sylvian fissure, it actually abuts the superior temporal gyrus. This seems to be a phonological sort of representation. So damage here can have, you know, Wernicke's aphasia-like consequences. Unfortunately, this is a case where the anatomical structure doesn't align very well with the functional things because there are actually three on the margins of this area, three different, largely different things going on. And unfortunately, people don't usually dissociate those when they're talking about SMG. So as a result, it's not as well understood exactly what it's doing. There's more controversy about it simply because it's probably doing some largely different things. It's heavily interconnected with the rest of the parietal cortex, so somatosensory areas in front of it, as well as visual parietal areas back here. This stuff does a lot of visual processing, kind of makes its way up here. And in general, the parietal lobe is thought of as a kind of an interface between body sensing spaces and external spaces, such as auditory and visual spaces. And this is also association cortex, which means, so around here especially, where it's far away from all the primary areas, that is very complex processing going on in there. There are areas that are involved in eye movements, arm movements, speech, all separately. But the representations back here get a lot more vague than you see in the primary motor cortex of the SMG. The parietal perculum, which is this bottom part that's inside the sylvian fissure that basically abuts the superior temporal gyrus, is also heavily interconnected with the insula, which is here, and the superior temporal gyrus. So it's probably getting a lot of auditory input in the parietal. And it is very active during speech, not surprisingly. So it might be a somato-auditory interface, amongst other things. As I mentioned, it's involved in a lot of things. So, for example, verbal working memory literature, a lot of people associate it with the so-called phonological store in Baddeley's model, which is a buffer for input for representing in a short-term auditory signals as phonological units. So if I, for example, if I'm talking in, like if you have to remember a phone number, you say the number in your head, and then you hear it in your head through the phonological store. So you're basically refreshing the phonological store by saying it in your head according to that model. And that phonological store, in that sense, is thought of as being probably in the supramarginal gyrus by other people that follow this. In speech production, it plays a role in somatosensory feedback control. We've seen this in a jaw perturbation experiment, for example, where we perturb your jaw when you're speaking in the scanner, and your supramarginal gyrus lights up. And we think that's some somatosensory error signals that are turning on in order to generate corrective movements in the somatosensory feedback control system. We'll flesh that out later. Okay. All right. So all of the areas I've talked about so far, where they show activity in speech, they also show activity for individual articulator movements. How do I know that? Because of this plot right here, where all those articulatory studies from before, now I'm plotting all of them together as blue dots, and I'm just plotting it on top of that activity from speech. And what you can see is all of this stuff is covered, the main motor and somatosensory stuff. The medial premotor areas and CMA are covered. There's actually more right hemisphere activity, and I'll talk about why that might be in a bit. But the only areas where you don't see are spherotemporal gyrus, which is auditory cortex. You see a little bit of larynx representation there, but it makes sense that the other movements wouldn't cause auditory activation. But they don't make sounds normally, or not. It's not a major component of what they do. So spherotemporal gyrus is largely speech-specific in terms of movement of the articulators, and the anterior insula and inferior frontal gyrus on the left. Less so on the right, especially the inferior frontal gyrus, which is that speech. So this stuff makes a lot of sense. These are language areas, and they're also involved in speech motor programming, very likely. And so these areas are probably largely involved in the planning of speech, whereas superior temporal gyrus is probably largely involved in decoding speech and representing the sounds so that you can use them to correct movement errors, for example. All right, so let's start with the inferior frontal gyrus. So inferior frontal gyrus in the left, often referred to as Brokaw's area, classically and just in the more general neuroscience literature, everybody thinks of it as language output, so planning utterances, things like that. It also does play some role in language perception. It seems to have syntactical processing areas that are important for understanding complicated sentences. So if I say a very simple version of a sentence like, the dog went to the store, I'm not sure why a dog would do that, but then you're able to understand it. But if you're Brokaw's aphasic, but I said the store was the place the dog went, then you're confused. The grammatical structure confuses you. I just made that a terrible example off the top of my head. There are much better real examples out there. But the bigger point is true, which is the more complicated the grammatical structure, the more impaired you are if you have Brokaw's aphasia. So it's not purely motoric. But it is very, very important. I mean, this is the most important part of the cortex for language, possible exception of the auditory cortex where it meets the supramarginal gyrus or Wernicke's area. And it's very left lateralized in speech normally, except when you perturb speech. We'll talk about later, then you can get more right hemisphere activity. And the activity you see for speech production when it's a very simple task is really mostly in the most posterior part of what's called the opercular part of the inferior frontal gyrus. So usually it's broken up into 3 sections, and they're referred to as pars opercularis, which we're going to use IFO, and that corresponds to Brodmann's area 44. That's the most posterior part. That's the part where we think speech motor programs are represented partially, in addition to ventropremotor cortex and the insula. The pars triangularis, IFT, which is BA45, and the pars orbicalis, which we'll use IFR for, that's BA47. That's the most anterior inferior one. For speech, it's mostly opercularis that's important, and then some triangularis in the opercular region. So pars opercularis is called opercularis because it includes the frontal operculum. But the frontal operculum also moves a little bit into pars triangularis, and that, so really the frontal operculum is the part that's most important for language for those areas, not the lateral surface of the inferior frontal gyrus pars triangularis, but this part. So it kind of curves around like this into the sylvian fissure. This part, not much activity during speech. This part, a lot of activity during speech. Also, the most posterior part of IFO is, most of that is active during speech on the left side. Okay, so these areas are heavily interconnected with premotor cortex. They're heavily interconnected with the anterior insula, which is, both of those are no surprise since they border those areas. And they're also heavily interconnected with the middle frontal gyrus. Middle frontal gyrus has some working memory related stuff in this inferior frontal sulcus. And there's also a lot of word access that seems to involve middle frontal gyrus. So when you have to pull out a word in a picture naming task, if the word, for various classes of word, it appears that middle frontal gyrus is involved in that. So it seems to be an interface between conceptual areas that represent, things in multi-dimensions, not just as words, but also as objects in the world, et cetera. And it interfaces with the IFG to get to the speech motor output system. And so generally speaking, these association areas, the highest areas of cortex, probably work their way into the motor system via something like the left inferior frontal gyrus, where language, for speech at least, where language is kind of constructed and concepts are put into words that are then, that phonological content sent down to the prefrontal cortex. And the left hemisphere is very left lateralized. So damage to an adult in the left hemisphere inferior frontal gyrus will cause Brocau's aphasia, especially if it involves areas around it, like white matter or middle frontal gyrus. On the right side, it does not cause Brocau's aphasia. There may be some impairment of speech, but nothing like Brocau's aphasia. Maybe some, and this is actually still, in my mind, not clear, but some people indicate that you get prosodic problems more so if you get damage to the right than you get, you don't get second. You can still say the right words and everything. The intonation might not be as good. In the right, it may also be involved in prosody perception. And one scientific anecdote, if there's such a thing, on this is there's a report where there was a doctor that was with a bunch of right hemisphere patients, well, stroke patients actually, and they were watching a speech by Ronald Reagan at the time. And one half of the room was infuriated afterwards, and the other half was like, I know what you're talking about. And the difference had to do with the interpretation of his prosody, basically, during the speech. And the claim from this anecdote is that the right hemisphere patients couldn't understand the prosody, which was comforting to the left hemisphere patients, apparently, but they could understand the words. And so that somehow made them feel one way, more angry, presumably, whereas the left hemisphere patients could see as emotional, the affect that he was projecting, which was confidence and positivity. And so they had a completely different view of what went down in the speech. Is that anecdote even true? I don't know, but it does fit with a lot of people's rough view of left hemisphere being far more important for what we would consider hardcore linguistic aspects, meaning generating the right words, understanding words and sentences, the right hemisphere more for processing affect, maybe intonation profile is the main aspect of affect that there seems to be some evidence for its involvement. Okay, so generally speaking, when people say Brokaw's area, they mean left IFO and IFT. However, that is not universal. Sometimes they mean the whole inferior frontal gyrus, including IFR. Sometimes they only mean IFO. And for these reasons, we will avoid using Brokaw's area. And hopefully, people, usually when they use Brokaw's area, they'll be a little more specific, and they should be, because it's too big a term. Okay. Well, in addition to Brokaw's aphasia, if you lesion IFG, you get buccofacial apraxia, which is characterized by problems doing normal gestures with the face, like blowing a kiss or things like that, that involve a degree of coordination of the facial structure to carry out a motor program. Damaging IFG can impair that in addition or separate from damaging language. And apraxia of speech is the speech disorder that's most commonly associated with that damage to IFO as well, inferior frontal gyrus, the posterior portion of the inferior frontal gyrus, mostly IFO. Apraxia of speech, however, so apraxia of speech is a disorder of speech motor programming. That's the best way to describe it in a small number of words. And basically what happens is people can say very simple utterances, but if you start having them produce more complex things, so they can say ta ta ta, but if you want to have them say ta pico, they are much worse at something like that. So they have issues with more complicated speech, as if the motor programs aren't there for the ability to produce complex syllables sometimes, and so forth. And so we'll think of it as damage to the regions that are either generating motor programs or either choosing the motor programs or where the motor programs themselves are represented. Now, speech scientists have moved toward a definition of apraxia of speech where the articulation has to be impaired when you produce it, speech. And so that would eliminate what would be called pure phonemic paraphasias. If I just say perfectly formed speech, but I'm using the wrong phonemes or they're in the wrong order, that's called a phonemic paraphasia. That used to be considered part of apraxia of speech, but in an attempt to kind of refine the definition, now that is by most speech scientists considered a bit different from apraxia of speech. I think of them as one of them is mostly impacting the working memory system that activates the motor programs. And that's probably going to be more related to damage in the inferior frontal sulcus, as we'll see, which is a working memory area. Whereas the part where the articulations are impaired, that's probably damage to the motor program part. And in the DIVA model, that's ventral premotor cortex. But roughly speaking, these lesions that cause both of those things are around the same areas. And it's still very much an active discussion as to what the site of damage is, the true site of damage for apraxia of speech. Nina Dronkers had done a very influential story, and to this day continues believing that it is the anterior insula that's damaged. Some people think it's the ventral premotor cortex. So Ziegler and colleagues in Germany refer to it as ventral premotor cortex. Others, such as Hillis and colleagues, say it's the inferior frontal gyrus, the posterior portion of the inferior frontal gyrus. What these areas all have in common is that they intersect each other right at the junction of the frontal lobe and the anterior insula. And so probably damage to any one of them can cause it, and depending on the individual, it may cover a different subset of the structures. So we'll get to that when we talk more about sequencing and apraxia of speech, but yeah, it's left premotor, inferior frontal gyrus, or insula damage, which sounds like three completely different structures, and many people don't realize they all intersect right near each other, and that's right at the frontal operculum again. So the reason frontal operculum is an important term for us is because that particular part of the inferior frontal gyrus is really the kind of most important part for the speech. Okay, so in DIVA, the left hemisphere IFO, we consider that to be part of the speech sound map, uh, where the motor programs are, along with ventral premotor cortex to which it abuts. So it's probably a continuation of the same map that's in one, kind of bleeds over into the other, and quite possibly bleeds into the insula as well. As I said, right hemisphere inferior frontal gyrus is not associated so much with language. It has been associated with things like response inhibition. So if I have a task, like let's say I put a cup in front of you, your natural instinct is to reach and pick it up. Let's say I usually make you do that, but sometimes I put a stop sign up and you have to stop, not do it. That seems to involve right inferior frontal gyrus as like a kind of a stop, an inhibition of movement or inhibition of doing some act. Other things it's been associated with are control of prosodic aspects of speech. As I mentioned, in particular, it may have a bigger role in intonation profile, which is a slowly varying thing, which right hemisphere structures seem to be a little better suited to processing than left hemisphere. And also, we think it's involved in feedback control of speech, which I thought was on the slide. Let's see. Oh, there, it's feedback control of speech. So when you perturb the speech articulators and people compensate for that, we see activity in right inferior frontal gyrus when they're doing that compensation. So we think of it as probably a premotorish job of figuring out how to compensate for perturbation, which is detected either auditorily or synesthetically. Another interesting aspect of it, IFG, is that it's involved in a lot of tasks that aren't speech related as well, most notably grasping. And there's quite a literature on this in monkeys. So the monkey equivalent of Brokaw's area is usually thought of as this region within the monkey motor areas as F5. F5 neurons in monkeys include what are called mirror neurons. Have you heard of mirror neurons? So a mirror neuron is a neuron where it becomes active if you watch somebody doing something that you're interested in, like opening a banana, and when you do it yourself. And it's thought to play a role in things like imitation, and this seems quite likely. When you watch something and your motor areas that are later going to do it are activated by watching somebody else do it. And you're probably kind of learning a little bit about how to do it during this period. And so that has been demonstrated much more thoroughly with grasping in monkeys. But people, including Arbib and Rizzolati's the main lab in Italy that identified mirror neurons originally and has studied them the most over time. They have a few papers out there that suggest a link between that grasping system and the evolution of language. And there's, for example, a paper called Language Within Our Grasp, which highlights the importance of the mirror neuron system in language-like things, most notably linking the thoughts and actions of one entity with another entity, and imitation. So imitation obviously is a huge part of how kids learn language. They're constantly hearing and then imitating things, but also that process of linking the outside world, you know, another person in many cases with your own actions is similar to a communication. It's kind of a form of communication, and they make the case, which is controversial but intriguing, that grasping system is actually the closest precursor to human speech rather than monkey vocalization. Is that true? Because monkey vocalization, recall, they don't learn new vocalizations, but they do learn new actions through the mirror neuron system. Well, at least it seems to involve the mirror neuron system. And so their case is that, you know, this mirror system is why we have language. It's central to language, and it probably evolved from grasping, not from, you know, vocalization type calls. Who knows? Controversial, not tough to prove, but an important kind of line of thought that's interesting to think about. Okay, the left inferior frontal sulcus is, I'm going to call it that, but you can think of it as the very dorsalmost part of the inferior frontal gyrus and the very ventralmost part of the middle frontal gyrus. That sulcus in between those two gyri is repeatedly shows up in studies of speech where there's a working memory component. In our studies, it's highly reliable that if we give you something difficult to produce that has multiple phonemes, you get activity in inferior frontal sulcus or more activity there. Whereas if we just have you do a very simple syllable like top, you get very little, almost no activity in inferior frontal sulcus, probably because there's almost no working memory load. So the more stuff you have to store up in working memory, the more active left inferior frontal sulcus is. It shows up as involved in working memory, generally speaking, bilaterally, the inferior frontal sulcus, but on the left side, there's specific more activity for speech tasks than non-speech tasks. So only in the left inferior frontal sulcus are language tasks, language working memory tasks, preferentially activating it as opposed to general working memory where it is also active. This area we're going to think of as being involved in buffering up phonemes for production. So let's say I have a whole phrase I want to say. I can't say all the phonemes at once. I got to store the later ones for sure. That storage, we think, is in left inferior frontal sulcus, and it interacts with ventral premotor cortex to pick out motor programs and produce the material sequentially one syllable at a time. So we think it plays a role in phonological working memory and speech. Okay, so next is the anterior insula. This is the most controversial area. It is undoubtedly active in most speech tasks that are not trivial. Some people have shown that if you just have people repeat a vowel over and over, it doesn't become active. That could be a power thing though, like maybe it is active, but there's not enough to pick up fMRI, it's unclear. But it's definitely active anytime you have complicated utterances. And a particular part of so it's the anterior insula that's most important. Posterior insula does not really become active during speech much at all. It's more involved in things like taste and dealing with the mouth, things in more of a non-speech context, where the anterior part anterior part where you have more sophisticated neocortex at the very most anterior part of the insula. This posterior stuff is usually mesocortex, so simpler cortex. This anterior stuff lights up in speech, and there may be a couple of different roles. So for example, working memory always activates anterior insula. So if you look at, well, always is strong, but if you look across many working memory studies, no matter what the working memory involves, it could be dots, it could be words, anterior insula is active, usually bilaterally. And that's at a very anterior part of the anterior insula. Further back in the insula, there's what's called the precentral gyrus of the insula. Conceptually, it may be okay to think of it as an extension of the precentral gyrus a little bit in the Rolanda cortex. But damage to the dorsal part of the precentral gyrus and insula is the exact part that Dronkers thinks causes apraxia of speech, because if you look across scans, everyone with apraxia seems to have damage there. Others have pointed out, like Hillis, that, well, that's because it's always damaged when there's a stroke in this artery that feeds this area. And so anytime there's a stroke, it's going to be damaged. And they say the inferior frontal gyrus is more important. Also, it depends on whether you look at immediately after the stroke versus several months later. Dronkers subjects, I believe, generally were well after the stroke where they looked at them, whereas the Hillis study looked more acutely, shortly after the stroke. Anyway, they're probably all kind of responsible for apraxia, but the precentral gyrus part, that part, Dronkers believes strongly is involved in coordinating articulation. So what we would call speech motor planning. That's a little bit of a non-mainstream view in that most people think ventral premotor cortex is the primary area. But again, ventral premotor cortex more or less abuts the precentral gyrus of the insula, so it's very difficult to kind of pull it out really cleanly. But there are definitely reports of apraxia of speech for any of these areas all around here. And this is that junction I was talking about where they all more or less meet up right around here. That's the front. Okay, the left precentral gyrus is the only place, again, or sorry, the left anterior insula is the only place that causes this apraxia of speech. The right does not, and the right is less active during speech. As I mentioned, a lot of the, so there's a big variation in cytoarchitecture within the insula. Some is allo or mesocortex, some is neocortex, for example. But some of the more anterior parts seem to have a structure that matches premotor cortex and inferior frontal gyrus. And the so people generally think of insula as a completely separate thing from from the inferior frontal gyrus, because most people don't really have a 3D view of how they connect, but they're abutting, and in fact they're continuous, and in fact the cytoarchitectonic boundaries there do not align with what's called the central sulcus of the insula, which is what separates them. So there's flow of probably what's going on in IFO is also happening somewhat in the anterior insula, and probably what's happening in ventral premotor cortex probably is also happening a little bit in the anterior insula as well. So these are some of the things that make it difficult to really dissociate what it's doing. I'm not going to go into, well, a little bit of background. So agranular cortex, there's some of that where layer 4 is essentially gone. Layer 4 is the granular layer. That's the input layer from the periphery. Not much of that in motor cortex. So that part of the anterior insula, the rostroventral part up here, seems to be kind of like primary motor cortex. Other parts that are dysgranular, that means there is a very thin, but at least some layer 4. That's more like Brodmann's area 44, which is the part of Brokaw's area, the inferior frontal gyrus. So again, although people don't, outside of our lab, most people do not break down the anterior insula into subregions. It's crucial that they do eventually, because they are very different in cytoarchitecture. They're very different in what they attach to, even though they're in close proximity to each other within the anterior insula. There's almost certainly different subtasks of speech happening in different parts of the anterior insula. So the anterior insula is also active during many non-speech functions. These include working memory, as I mentioned, drive and affect, much like the cingulate motor area. A lot of the anterior insula is paralimbic, and so that's not surprising. But also gustation, so taste and olfaction seem to involve the anterior insula, especially the more allocortexy parts, the more rudimentary older parts. It's definitely active during speech. Damage to it is highly associated with apraxia of speech, but it's still controversial to say that it's the site of apraxia of speech. It is, I think Dronkers would say it's the site of articulatory coordination for speech. However, and that may be true that some of that happens there, I would say that it's not, if so, it's definitely not the only site that's involved in that. The ventral premotor cortex almost certainly plays a role in that. Okay, so I already talked about the Dronkers and this. So this is a controversy that still, we can still take sides. But there's no, unlike the stutter, actually physically touch each other. We'll talk more about that when we get to stuttering. One other thing about the insula that may or may not be important is that insula and the anterior cingulate cortex are the only human brain areas that contain the largest neurons in any animal's brains, which are called spindle neurons or von Economo neurons. They are only found in great apes, cetaceans, which are whales and dolphins, humans, which are great apes, of course, and then elephants. And it's unclear, but because they're mostly in the higher animals, people have said, oh, maybe they have something to do with consciousness or whatever. Essentially, no real evidence of that. It's more likely, I think, that they're involved in generating signals across long distances quickly, because whales are big, dolphins are big, elephants are big, primates have big axons to some parts of their bodies. So no, so it's not just because they're large. It seems to be fairly advanced animals that are large. So, but monkeys, which are super smart as well, don't have them, and it's arguable whether a dolphin is smarter than a monkey. So it's not just intelligence and cognitive ability. It did evolve late in the evolutionary stream, but seemingly not that late, because whales are not closely related to humans and dolphins. As I mentioned, they actually split before we had 6-layer cortex. Whales have 4, and dolphins. So who knows for sure. The other reason I think it's probably not related to consciousness or that sort of thing is that it's in the paralimbic cortex, not the neocortex. So people have suggested it's maybe rapid neural communication to limbic targets in particular that they're important for, as opposed to, say, motor targets. But anyway, they're a hot topic in neuroscience because they were discovered 10, 15 years ago. Okay, the last chunk of cortex we'll talk about is the temporal cortex, superior temporal cortex. The areas involved in speech of the superior temporal in the temporal lobe are the superior and, to a lesser degree, the middle temporal cortex, most notably the sulcus in between. So the dorsal part of the middle temporal gyrus and the ventral part of the superior temporal gyrus. I'm going to call that the superior temporal sulcus. So the primary auditory cortex is Heschel's gyrus. It's on the supratemporal plane inside the fissure here. Immediately behind it is the planum temporale, which some people consider part of the posterior superior temporal gyrus. Others can consider it a separate structure. But anyway, it's very important for representing speech, like sounds. And it's also in the supratemporal plane, so inside the sulcus. And then the lateral part of the superior temporal gyrus, the part that's out of the sulcus, which we'll just call superior temporal gyrus here. In our parcellation system, I'm actually including planum temporale in the definition of superior temporal gyrus, just to simplify the diagrams mostly. But these areas are the most important for speech, other than, of course, getting auditory input from the periphery. You can eliminate Heschel's gyrus unilaterally and have very little effect on speech, almost no effect on speech, because the auditory projections project bilaterally from the inferior colliculus and lower structures. I mentioned in the auditory system, there's a lot of crossover early on, probably because of having to do temporal alignment of things from the 2 different ears to do localization and things like that. But in any case, if you eliminate Heschel's gyrus, you don't go deaf unless it's bilateral. If you eliminate bilaterally Heschel's gyrus and the posterior superior temporal gyrus, you can get what's called pure word deafness, which I think it's you keep Heschel's, but you bilaterally eliminate the planum temporale and posterior superior temporal gyrus, is when you get pure word deafness. They can hear sounds, they can hear your speech coming out as an acoustic signal, but they do not understand words. Otherwise, they can generate language. They just, when you talk to them, they don't understand the meaning of the words. And that's called pure word deafness. Interestingly, that has to be bilateral, and that highlights something about the auditory system, which is the motor system. In the motor system, especially premotor planning areas for language, they're very much left lateralized. That is far less true in the auditory system. Speech perception experiments, it's almost perfectly bilateral activity that you see in the superior temporal gyrus. They may be doing somewhat different things, probably certainly not identical, most likely, but it's much more bilateral than the inferior frontal gyrus. That said, Wernicke's aphasia, which is language reception problems, don't understand language, although you can generate it, that generally involves left hemisphere, supramarginal and posterior superior temporal gyrus. Probably not because those areas themselves, I think, are lateralized, but probably because those are the ones that get the input primarily from the left frontal cortex. So I think my sense basically is that for language production, it's severely left lateralized in most people. For perception, it's less so, and the lateralization probably has a lot to do, any lateralization that is there probably has a lot to do with the fact that it's very heavily interconnected with left lateralized frontal cortex, which is very different in laterality, left to right. Okay. So the primary auditory cortex heavily interconnect. So it gets most, if not all, but most of the input from the periphery comes there, and then it goes to the higher order auditory cortical areas. Primary auditory cortex is usually referred to as BA 41, 42, or maybe just 41, with 42 being secondary, depending on the author. But those are all on Heschel's gyrus. The step around it is higher order auditory cortex, which is in Brodmann's area 22. And there's somewhat of a distinction between posterior areas, which seem to not care so much about phonological units, but care more about the sound signal more continuously. And they're very much involved in speech production. For example, hearing that your sound isn't quite right and correcting it largely involves posterior superior temporal gyrus. Speech recognition, on the other hand, in the sense of hearing the words and phonemes, seems to rely more on the anterior portions of the superior temporal gyrus. So people talk about dorsal and ventral streams in the auditory cortex. Dorsal and ventrals, simplifying it and not kind of ignoring a lot of the actual complexity of the anatomy. Certainly there's an anterior stream here that would be called ventral by Hickok and Popel and people like that, that's more involved in language recognition, and a posterior / dorsal stream that seems to be more involved in motor control and finer grained auditory representation of speech. The middle temporal gyrus, really it's just the sulcus that it shares with the superior temporal gyrus that's active. That area, superior temporal sulcus, is an area of multimodal integration. So visual, auditory stuff meet up in there. There are representations of biological movement within there. So not just speech movements, but other kind of movements. If you watch an animal move, often if that's the same kind of animal as you, you're a primate, so that you have a superior temporal sulcus, then your activity in that superior temporal sulcus may reflect biological motion of that other animal. And in speech, presumably the equivalent of that would be kind of representing the sounds coming from the other animal, and integrating visual and motor, or visual and auditory representations of those sounds. But the real focus here will be on the posterior superior temporal gyrus. For our purposes, that's the most important for speech production. Heschel's gyrus, of course, is important in that it has to convey the information up there, but Heschel's gyrus is not speech specific at all, or very, very little speech specificity, meaning that it just generally processes sound signals spectrotemporally. So speech will activate Heschel's gyrus, but no more than reverse speech, for example. But in planum temporal, reverse speech does not activate Heschel's gyrus as much as forward speech, and also in the other higher order auditory cortical areas. So specificity for speech in the auditory system happens in Brodmann's area 22 in the higher order auditory cortical areas. It's still, you're hearing phonemes, that there's so much shared phonology, even amongst the most unrelated languages. There's still vowels, for example, the corner vowels are almost always used. That probably it's still very active. My guess it's going to be even more active because you're like, especially if you're trying to learn that language. Well, and like if you're trying to learn the language yourself, then you have to represent your errors, and you're going to have a lot more errors going on. You need to, I think it'll be pretty active under those circumstances. And learning of these new sounds like that for a different language seem to involve frontal operculum combined with this posterior superior temporal gyrus. Like we see correlations with learning rate in those two areas with how well you learn new sounds that come from a different language, for example. And for the record, mirror neurons, which we believe, which in humans are thought of being in this IFO region, in the DIVA model, which had mirror neurons before there were mirror neurons, they're in what we're going to call the speech sound map. So those are the cells that they hear you say a syllable, they represent that syllable, and then as you learn to produce that syllable, they're involved in that process so that you activate it later if you want to produce the syllable during speech.
So is
Yeah, and it doesn't, gyrus doesn't really care if it's a discrimination versus a identification task, for example. So the difference there is if I give you two sounds, are they the same or different? That's a discrimination task that requires very low level auditory things. If I give you some phonemes like pa, ba, and you're supposed to say is it P or B or whatever, you're supposed to identify the phonemes, that is an identification task. Those differentially activate the anterior, the higher order areas, but not the primary very much. And so another way of putting that is that higher order auditory cortical areas are more interconnected with the attentional system or the cognitive systems of the brain. I should have defined this earlier, but does everybody know what I mean when I say higher order auditory cortical areas? Okay, so in cortex, people usually break up cortex into a few classes of regions. One that's always there is primary. So primary sensory cortex, primary auditory cortex, direct input from the periphery, or primary motor cortex, direct neurons to the periphery. Secondary cortex is a term that's sometimes used. That would mean something that's not that directly connected to the periphery, but still just represents one type of sensory information or one motor modality. So you might consider premotor cortex, could conceivably be considered secondary cortex. However, secondary cortex was applied to a lot of things, and then they find more, which would be called tertiary cortex. But instead, most people just lump secondary and tertiary because it's not, I mean, it's kind of arbitrary how many levels you break it into. So when I say higher order cortex, I mean, so if I say higher order somatosensory cortex, I mean it's somatosensory cortex, but it's not connected to the periphery directly. It's processed somatosensory information. So that's where you start seeing things like combinations of joint movements that involve a reach, or things, like higher level representations of sensory stimuli that require a ton of processing to detect them. And so in auditory cortex, detecting speech sounds would be something higher order cortex does because it requires a lot of processing of the primary sensory information, and it's not primary cortex, it's outside of it. That's in humans. The third type of cortex, or fourth, depending on how you're counting, is association cortex, and that's where it's no longer just one modality. So it's not just motor or just somatosensory or just visual. So parietal cortex is an association cortex area where visual, auditory, and somatosensory information combines. Prefrontal cortex is an association area where a lot of planning type stuff happens. But both of them are very far from the periphery and involve multiple sensory and motor modalities. So I'm usually going to use primary, higher order, and association to refer to those three. Usually secondary, but some of the anatomical terms still use secondary. If you do a what? Then yeah.
Like for example, when you ask the specific
Yep. Possible. Yep.
or like to have a target in your new
Mhm.
do you think that in addition to that primary cortex area, do you think that all the other
Definitely the higher, or if it involves speech at all, higher order auditory areas are the ones that are mostly important for that because they're the ones that process that. And so, yeah, the more complex the speech task, the higher, if it's in the auditory system, the higher order the auditory system. One last confusing fact about auditory representations is in humans, they use primary, possibly secondary, higher order auditory cortex. In monkeys, they use core, belt, and parabelt to refer to perhaps the same things. So if you hear core belt and parabelt, and if they're talking about humans, you know it's somebody who does monkey research right away. It's like a dead giveaway. Okay. All right, so posterior superior temporal gyrus, especially the posterior part, projects to ventral Rolandic cortex, so the motor and somatosensory portions of the speech articulators. So they are interconnected, auditory, posterior auditory cortex and motor and somatosensory areas. That is much less true if it's true at all of Heschel's gyrus. So primary, and the way I think about it is what business would primary auditory cortex have activating motor structures? It doesn't know anything, whereas the higher order areas do know stuff and are interacting with speech level motor areas. As we mentioned, if you perturb auditory feedback, either pitch or formant frequencies, you get bilateral increased activation in the posterior superior temporal gyrus. This was a prediction we made with the DIVA model, and then we verified it with fMRI, and others have since verified it further. We call these auditory error maps. And so what they are happening in the model, doing in the model is they're basically detecting that your speech signal that you're hearing isn't matching what you're trying to do. So even though there's no net change in the frequency content, say, or the loudness of the speech or anything, there's an increase in auditory cortex if the speech doesn't match what you want. And so that was a novel prediction that we made, and we tested for it, and sure enough, there it is. And I think that's pretty strong evidence that they are indeed auditory error maps. They're listening to your speech and becoming active when they hear that speech mismatching what the expectations are. And those errors are then going to be translated through the right frontal cortex in our model into corrective commands. And that's feedback, auditory feedback. Okay, and I mentioned that left PSDG was initially associated. Initially, people thought it was just the left posterior superior temporal gyrus that was Wernicke's area, meaning the area that was causing receptive aphasia. But later studies noted that actually it has to also include supramarginal gyrus and white matter for that to occur. Especially with the white matter part, that might be why it's left lateralized, where this damage causes the problem, because the white matter from the left frontal cortex gets into the higher order auditory areas, probably initially from the left hemisphere and then goes over to the right hemisphere. So damage to the left would damage to the fibers in the left hemisphere, for example, in the posterior part of the cortex would be the only ones that cause language problems. Even though the cortex itself, the auditory cortex, may be doing more or less the same thing. And that's kind of held out where you don't, it's more bilateral in the auditory system, except when it comes to aphasia that involves not just the auditory areas, but white matter and stuff. Interestingly, auditory cortical areas become active even during covert speech or inner speech. So even though you're not making any sound, your auditory cortex, especially in the left, you just tie it in. So covert speech compared to, so overt speech, you see bilateral activation with a little bit of left, more left premotor. Covert speech, it's almost all lateralized. You don't see right motor cortex, but you do see left motor cortex, and you do see some left auditory area. So inner speech is using a subset, presumably, of the structures that are used, probably the ones that are involved in planning, and that includes the auditory cortical area. So you don't have to have auditory input to get these higher auditory cortical areas activated. Also, if you're watching a moving mouth, it activates the auditory cortex even if there's no sound. How many of you heard of the McGurk effect? Which everyone? That's an example of where you hear something different, I mean, and you really think you're hearing it, depending on whether you're looking at a moving face or not. So the exact same sound, you close your eyes, you hear it as a completely different phoneme. And I think that highlights that even at people have claimed, at least with fMRI, it's even primary auditory cortex that becomes active during that type of McGurk sort of task, which suggests that actually even the primary areas aren't completely unimodal. They're more unimodal, but not 100%, if that is in fact true, that stimulate can activate auditory cortex, which appears to be. All right. Last topic is we've talked about this a lot, but I want to summarize it again. Lateralization of speech and language processing. To a first order approximation, you can think of language as being left lateralized and speech being more bilateral. But there are a lot of little exceptions here. The premotor cortex, for example, which is more speechy than languagey, that is left lateralized. The lateralization you see the most strong is left lateralized prefrontal cortex, so inferior frontal gyrus, those area. But you also see, even in subcortical structures like we talked about last week, languagey things that are on the more left lateralized. And one example of that is that if you look at fMRI activity, it's a little more active in the left than the right in the striatum and thalamus, and a little more active in the right in the cerebellar cortex. Recall that the cerebellum is connected with the opposite side of cortex, so again, that would imply left cortex. If you stimulate left hemisphere subcortical structures, in particular the caudate and the thalamus, VL thalamus, you can get entire words being produced, but you cannot get that if you stimulate the right. So again, something different about the left, exactly how different, not entirely clear yet. In the cerebral cortex, the most very clear-cut thing is apraxic speech. Almost always involves the language dominant hemisphere, which is predominantly the left hemisphere. And that's damage to the IFG, VPMC, or anterior insula, all of which are probably involved in speech, motor programming / planning to some degree. And that seems to be left lateralized in cortex pretty strongly. When we look at speech activity for longer utterances, we get far more lateralization, and it's more anterior in the frontal cortex. So the inferior frontal sulcus I mentioned becomes more active in the left. We also get more inferior frontal gyrus on the left if people say sentences as opposed to just saying single meaningless words. So working memory for phonological units may well be, and probably is, left lateralized. Auditory cortex has also been described as lateralized, and this has a long history. Initially, with Wernicke's studies, people thought, oh, the words must be in the left hemisphere, posterior superior temporal gyrus. That turns out not to probably be the case. They seem to be bilateral. You have to have bilateral damage to get pure word deafness, for example. Another thing that people have been saying for many years in many different forms, most recently by Popel and colleagues, is that in auditory cortex, it seems that left hemisphere may be specialized for faster changes in the auditory signal, like voice onset timing and other, form trajectories, things that happen quite quickly, whereas the right hemisphere may be more involved in slower varying things like the intonation profile. And there's some evidence for that, but even if you're just listening to a very slowly varying intonation profile, you get bilateral activity. And even if you're just listening to very fast, noisy stuff, you get right. So they're both somewhat bilateral. It's just a matter of degree. How much more is it lateralized in one or the other, but there does seem to be something to that where, to some degree, the left hemisphere of auditory cortex appears at least to be more involved in rapidly changing stimuli, and the right in slowly changing stimuli. And the final example of lateralization we mentioned was mutism in the SMA. Transient mutism will occur, but only for left SMA damage. But keep in mind that a month later, that this mutism almost always goes away. So it's not as crucial as the left ventral prefrontal cortex, where apraxia never goes away. Okay. Any questions? Any of them? Maybe a good time, since I joked about the midterm before, in a way, to scare you. I'll talk just very briefly for a couple of just going to point out that the midterm is going to be multiple choice, 25 multiple choice questions, and I'll send you some example questions before, but it's basically the most salient things that I've discussed in the class, the most salient things in the book. So a good way to study, for example, would be to reread the conclusions of every chapter that's covered in the midterm, and then go back on anything you don't understand and look it up in the book, in the main body of the chapter. But it will focus on multiple choice questions aimed at just the most important stuff. It won't be like, I won't ask you to draw the cell side. I might ask you to draw some central cell. That's actually something good. All right, thanks. What's that? Yeah, it's pretty easy. You better be able to answer that one. Take it easy, Elaine. Oh, okay. So I am in the meeting.